Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey there, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's guest is Jessica Lahey. Jessica wrote a wonderful book called The Addiction Inoculation, and she and I are going to be talking about how to best protect our kids from using substances and developing substance use disorders. This is a really interesting and helpful conversation, and if you have little kids, there are things here for you as well. It's almost too late, Jessica says, if you wait to start having these conversations with your kids until high school. So don't think that this conversation about substance use is only for parents like me of older kids. This applies to all of us, and there's some really great practical takeaways in this episode. Jessica speaks to parents, educators, school administrators, coaches, pastors, and community leaders about the science of learning, motivation, engagement, and substance abuse prevention, all in service to the belief that adults have the power to help kids become more autonomous, competent, connected, and fulfilled. Her first book, The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go So Their Children Can Succeed, was a New York Times bestseller and has empowered so many to strengthen homeschool partnerships, support kids as they learn from their mistakes, and forge stronger, more trusting relationships with children. Her second book, The Addiction Inoculation: Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence, is the culmination of Lahey's experience as an alcoholic with over 6 years of recovery, the parent of 2 kids, 20 years in the classroom teaching, and 5 years spent teaching in an inpatient drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think of this conversation and how you're going to implement some of the strategies that we talked about. Be sure to join our free Facebook group. You can just search up Peaceful Parenting with Sarah Rosensweet, and let's have a conversation about some of this stuff. Talking about it is so important. I think that's something that you're going to get when you listen to this conversation with Jess. Hi, Jess. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I loved your book. First of all, I just wanted to say that. And I think it's really a must read for all parents. It's so full of great research and your own story and really, really practical tips. So I just thank you for writing it. I think it's just really, really useful. And I'm going to recommend it to everyone I know.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book?
So both of my books have come out of my own experience of I have the coolest job in the world, which is to get really curious about a question and then, get to lock myself in a room, with 1,000 books and, just sort of research it for, read all the studies and read all the books about it and sort of figure out. So, The Gift of Failure came out of, what is overparenting doing to kids' motivation and kids' learning. And The Addiction Inoculation really came out of, I got sober myself. And then after, and after coming to terms with what probably led to my own issues with substance use disorder, I had to start thinking about my kids and thinking about, okay, well, if I come from a long line of alcoholics, how do I prevent their being just the next in that very long line? How, when I look at the research and people say that all the experts say that substance use disorder is preventable, what does that big word preventable mean? And then comes the really fun part, which is taking all of that research. Luckily, I'm married to and the mother of people who are statistician is a very big part of what they do. So I take all that research and sort of, run it through the ringer, figure out what's valid and what's not valid, and then translate it. I mean, as I said, I love my job. So, while both of the books are really important to me, and Gift of Failure was my, that baby, that first book, The Addiction Inoculation really for me is what has made a lot of the struggle of substance use disorder. And working with kids as a teacher for 5 years in a drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents, and raising 2 kids who are really going to have to face a lot of the same stuff that I had to face, that's what's made this all worth it. So both of those books are near and dear to my heart.
So I'll have to put your first book on my list. I have not read that, but that sounds really wonderful as well.
It turns out there's a ton of dovetail between the two. Like, we know for a fact that self efficacy and feelings of competence are, during adolescence when baseline levels of dopamine are lower than at any other time during life. We know that, in order to get those great dopamine hits, that, having a feeling of mastery and competence and self efficacy is really, really important. And it turns out it's actually really preventative against substance use disorder. And that whole first book, The Gift of Failure, is about, helping kids achieve those feelings of mastery and self-efficacy. And so anyway, I've found a lovely middle ground between the two where I tend to spend most of my time, at least when I'm, talking about the work.
I want to come back to the dopamine question a little bit later on in our conversation, but first, one thing that struck me when I was reading your book was you talk about authoritative parenting, and authoritative parenting is really what I practice and teach at Peaceful Parenting is another word for authoritative parenting. And you talk about how that parenting style is the most protective parenting style to help kids not develop substance use disorders. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Just I think our listeners would like to hear that they're already, by practicing peaceful parenting, they're already sort of going down the right track of helping kids grow up without having substance use problems.
I think a lot of people misunderstand the whole idea of what parenting styles are all about and sort of envision just two, that there's like the really dictatorial, really, spare the rod and spoil the child, sort of that one. And then there's the opposite, which is just step back and let him go wild and go crazy. And that's couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, when I talk about the gift of failure in particular, and I talk about helping kids feel more competent, I say, look, I'm not abandoning my kids and just sort of saying, just have at it. Good luck. The idea is that we're autonomy supportive, that we support kids' ability to make some decisions on their own. And with where substance use disorder is concerned, there's a lot of fear around, oh my gosh, if my kids try drugs and alcohol, knowing what we know about the younger a kid is, the higher their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder becomes. There's this idea that we can't control it. We have to hold on really, really, really tight. And there has to be some middle ground. And I have to say, actually writing the addiction inoculation on the heels of the gift of failure, there was a big conundrum because we know that the more we, are sort of on top of our kids, the less, there's this one thing in the research that was really tough, which is we know that a time when kids try drugs and alcohol most often is, if they're going to try them, is during the summer when they're with their peers and there are no adults around. So what is the answer then? Never ever let your kids be alone with other adolescents? I mean, that makes no sense. As my husband likes to say, if our children never ever went outside, we could prevent a lot of melanoma, but that's just not how we can't do it that way. So it's this black and white thinking that I work really hard to sort of try to get people to think about all that lovely gray area. And I think the idea that we have really high standards for our kids, we give our kids a sense of trust, that let them know that we have high expectations and that we trust them to make good decisions, that we give them the information they need in order to make those good decisions. We give them the refusal skills they need in order to up the chances they won't make the bad decisions. And then we have really clear consequences when those very high expectations are not upheld. But that means we have to step back a little and not be so directive and not be so controlling. For example, we know that highly controlled kids lie to their parents more than
That's
kids
right.
who
They
have,
just get better at sneaking.
autonomy. Yeah, who have
Yeah.
autonomy supportive
Yeah.
parents. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So those parenting styles that you're talking about, they've got the authoritarian, that my way or the highway, right? And then you've got the permissive. And the way I describe it is you take authoritarian style, you drop out all of the fear and, that set of tools. But if you don't replace it with something else, then you get permissive parenting, right? And so with peaceful parenting or authoritative parenting, we still have those high expectations you're talking about, but then we have the support that kids need to meet those high expectations. So I love that you talk about that. And I like to think of, okay, maybe consequences, and especially natural ones, but also the support to meet the expectations And that's the big part of the authoritative model. I think that's helpful.
Well, and I think that's why the whole middle, for example, of Gift of Failure is about executive function and how we can't, and this book was written when I was a middle school teacher. So middle school is this big setup, right, where kids do not have the upper brain function to handle all that we throw at them. And so the glory of being a middle school teacher or the parent of a middle school kid is they're going to screw up over and over and over again. And so the idea is we don't chip away at them every single time they do something wrong. We wait for the really good learning moments, and then we come with supports. And the whole middle section of The Gift of Failure really is about this fact that kids' brains aren't done developing until their early to mid 20s. And what are we going to do in the meantime? So here's all the executive function skills, and how do we support each one of these individual skills while they're still developing in your kids so that they can feel that it's okay and in fact, it's expected that they're going to make mistakes, and that we're going to support them in figuring out what to leave behind and what to take with them so that the next iteration will be different, might be more successful. And that's sort of at the essence of sort of everything that I do around education in kids.
Yeah, and it's giving them the space to make those mistakes while they're still at home, and have us as a safety net, rather than controlling all aspects of their lives until they move out, and then then they're making the mistakes without any support, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast the other day, and this mother whose ex-husband had done some horrific things was trying to explain to her children why their dad was not around because he was in jail. And it was so amazing how she handled it. But one of the things I was most impressed by was she said to her very young children, she said, everyone breaks rules sometimes. Little kids break rules sometimes, but when big people break rules, can be some really, really big consequences. And right now, Daddy is essentially in a big person timeout, having to spend a lot of time thinking about the rules that he broke and hopefully learning. I mean, this is an idealized version of our prison system, but hopefully learning some skills so that, he cannot make those mistakes again. But essentially, I love the fact that she was defining, my ideals as a parent and as a teacher in her explanation to her children about where their dad had gone. Because, the consequences really do go up. And so if we can let kids make some of these mistakes when they're younger and not impose adulthood on, middle schoolers, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, for sure. So I have heard, and I don't think you spelled it out exactly in your book, but I have heard that connection with parents is a really also very protective for kids, for teenagers,
Mm-hmm.
like keeping that connected relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Right.
that something that you found in your research?
Well, and it's not, there's a lot of evidence out there. There's a really wonderful quote from, I believe, Dr. Joseph Califano about the fact that one of the most protective things we can do is have family dinner with kids. So I do talk about that. But the issue there is that I also talk about that dinner, that family dinner ideal, which is great, which is fantastic. And I'm totally behind family dinner. But I think a lot of parents, especially parents of kids that are really harried and overscheduled and all that sort of stuff, and for parents that do shift work and parents that, hold down more than one job, that idealized family dinner thing, if it's held up as this emblematic thing you have to do, then a lot of people are going to throw their hands up and say, well, I can't do that. That's just not viable in my family. So I really think that family dinner is it is representative of an example of, making sure that we create space for our kids to feel like they can talk, to create a check-in time, whether that's on a car ride, whether that's over breakfast, whether that's whatever. But essentially that we have a time that is really just dedicated to coming together as a family and checking in with each other. So that's really important. And then I also talk in Gift of Failure. Connectedness is one of the three big elements of creating intrinsic motivation, according to Edward Deci. And that's autonomy, competence, and connection. And that connection for parents really is quite simple. It comes down to what authoritative parenting looks like, essentially, is being there for our kids when they make mistakes, making sure they're loved for who they are and not who we wish they were, and all sorts of other elements like that.
I love that you have the caveat about the family dinner, because we don't have family dinner very often in our house, but we spend a lot of time together at other times. It's just that dinner is not a time when people are home a lot. So we spend tons of other time together. And I've always told myself it's not the dinner, it's the time spent together. And dinner is a good example of that.
Yeah. I think, it's funny. I was thinking about this last night because last night my oldest son is home. He's normally lives in New York City, has a job there, but he's home for a little bit. And we had a killer family dinner last night, outside. It was nice out. The bugs stayed away, but that was that was really special because it was a rarity for us. Our connection time more often looks like, when the youngest comes downstairs and is practicing guitar in the kitchen near me while my husband walks in the door at the end of the day, and we just happen to all be in the same space. But that happens to be when my youngest is most ready to talk. So if I go about saying, no, family dinner is where we have the best talks, and I impose my expectations and rules on when we're going to connect, that doesn't work well either.
Yeah, for sure. Well, okay, so there was one thing that I thought I want to go into some tips for best practices at different ages, because a lot of my listeners do have younger kids. So I want to ask you about pre-K and kindergarten and also elementary kids. But there was one thing I wanted to ask you about first, which I thought was really interesting in the book. You talk about, and we hear this all the time, that this myth of the French children, and, give your kids like a little bit of
Yeah,
alcohol when
right.
they're growing up and it won't be so forbidden. And you really have a lot to say about that in the book. Can you share your ideas about that, giving kids alcohol at home?
Yeah, so this is actually the biggest pushback I get. This is the area, the bruise, the pain sensitive area that a lot of parents, they just want to believe in this. So they want to believe in two things. Number one, they either want to believe in the myth of that you can, by being like those European families where kids can have sips or kids can have their own glass, that somehow we can teach moderation, or that we can make it so that when our kids are exposed to alcohol, that it's not as big of a deal and they don't go crazy. It just doesn't work. Number one, for the portion of the population that I happen to belong to, where I do have substance use disorder, moderation is not something I can learn. And, it sounds great, but it just doesn't work. The other problem is that, the European Union as a whole, and actually France is a big part of this problem, has the highest rate of alcohol consumption in the entire world. And people want it. It's crazy. I mean, and this is coming from the World Health Organization, this data. And no, it's not just Eastern Europe. In fact, Eastern Europe has made some enormous gains in terms of reducing the amount of alcohol that is consumed because they realized they had such a problem. There are a few countries within Europe that have lower consumption rates, but mainly that has a lot to do with community norms around whether or not it's cool to be falling down drunk. And there are some European countries in which that is just not cool. And so it just actually underlines, for me anyway, the power of community norms and expectations around shaping reality. So when I push back and I say, that European myth is a myth that we have to blow apart in many different ways, that's where I go with that. And then the other one is, well, kids are going to drink anyway. It's futile to try to make it not happen. And so maybe I should just have a party at our house. I'll buy the beer. I'll take away all the keys and everyone will be safe. Well, the problem there is that the children of permissive parents, the children of parents who have a permissive stance on drugs and alcohol, which means anything other than no, not until it's legal for you, have kids with higher rates of substance use disorder. Yes, there are some statistical confounders in there, but what we know is that parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until it's legal for you, and keep in mind, for me, that legality issue is less about legality and more about reaching an age at which brain development is nearly complete, because that's what we're talking about here. Adult drinking and adolescent drinking, or drug use and drinking, are not the same. It does a lot more damage to an adolescent brain, and you can't go back and remediate that. So there are a lot of problems with those myths. And again, it's the stuff that parents push back on the hardest.
Yeah, and a couple things. I mean, you talk in the book about how the longer kids wait to try drugs or alcohol, the lower their chances are that they're going to end up with substance use disorder. And I think that's really, I've talked to my kids about that. I have, two teenagers and a 21-year-old. And the other thing that I think is really interesting, I've had lots of conversation with parents, just like you've said, about, well, I'd rather have them drinking at home where I know nobody's driving and blah, blah, blah. And first of all, you're sending the message that it's okay to drink, right? And second of all, I read this in another book, that you've just taken away the most powerful reason your kids can give for saying no to drinking, which is like my parents would kill me. And the other kids can say, well, no, they wouldn't. They let us drink at your house last weekend, right?
Exactly. Well, and actually, that's why there's 2.5 pages of I hit up kids for, okay, if you were at a party and you didn't want to drink or use, what excuses could you give that would not make you feel like a total dork or a nerd? And they gave me 2.5 pages of some of the most incredible real life excuses that they could give and rely on that they had in their back pocket. And my parents, my parents are such jerks, they drug test, or my parents are such jerks, they do breathalyzers or whatever. That's one of them. Fine, throw me under the bus. I don't care about that. That's fine with me. But those 2.5 pages were two of my favorite, 2.5 of the most entertaining pages to compile in the whole book. It was really fun.
Yeah, and I think for parents listening, it's really important to go over those, to go over those with your kids. Like, what are, have 5 things at your disposal that you could pull on when you are, not if you are, offered drugs and alcohol.
And that's the word inoculation. Yeah, and that's where the word inoculation comes from in the title, inoculation theory, which is when your kids feel empowered with these refusal skills, they are going to be a lot more likely to use them. That's what the research on inoculation theory shows. And by the way, to go back to another point you made, which is the younger a kid is when they first try drugs and alcohol, the higher their lifelong risk of substance use disorder is. It's not a small difference. If a kid is in 8th grade, which by the way is the average age of initiation in this country, around 13.5 to 13.7, when a kid is in 8th grade, if they try drugs and alcohol, their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder is up around 50%. But if we can get them to, senior year of high school, we can get it down between 10 and 17%. So it's a massive difference. It's not a small difference. Again, statistical, confounders and issues and stuff like that, correlation, causation stuff, but that's the best data we have.
Well, looking at, we were talking about connection earlier and, other risk factors. I mean, I recently saw the documentary, The Wisdom of Trauma. Have you seen that?
Mm-hmm.
The Gabor
Mm-hmm.
Mate?
Yes, yes.
And he really talks
I'm a
about it.
fan of his.
That's such a good documentary. We'll link to that in the show notes for anyone. But he talks about addiction as a response to trauma. And, and I think that one of the things that is traumatic for kids is, family problems. We've already sort of talked about that, wanting to be connected, but also the peer stuff. Right. And one of the things that you talk about in your book that I thought was really interesting was, helping kids to navigate peer issues and friend groups. And you also talk about that starting with young ages. So maybe now would be a good time to sort of get some of those tips. I know you have some ideas for little kids. So maybe you could give us some of those tips, and then we'll talk more about elementary and the peer stuff.
Yeah, it's really frustrating when I send the book out to, school leaders, because we happen to know that when school leaders are on board with the drug and alcohol setting community standards and the drug and alcohol prevention programs, if they even use one, that the more those administrators are involved, the more likely other people are to be invested as well. So I'll send this book out to a principal of like a kindergarten, nursery school, elementary school, and they'll say, oh, that's great. I sent it off to the principal of the high school because that's where they talk about all that stuff. And I'm like, no, this is the problem. If we're waiting until middle school to talk about any of this stuff, then we're waiting too long. So for little kids, we're talking about just bodily autonomy and safety stuff. Like, sweetie, why do you think while you're brushing your teeth, say something like, sweetie, why do you think we spit out the toothpaste instead of swallowing it? Why wouldn't we swallow it? Isn't more better? Wouldn't we want to swallow the fluoride? And, having conversations about that, having conversations about topical versus stuff you take internally, whether it's the Tide Pods or whether it's, and then moving on to conversations like, oh, there's this, prescription bottle on the counter, and can you find the letters of mommy's name on that prescription bottle? And then having a conversation from there about why we don't take prescriptions that don't have our name on them, that's specifically formulated for mommy, not for you. When you open the door with conversations like that, it's really easy to sort of find the moments that are developmentally and cognitively appropriate for those kids as they get older and things become less abstract and more, a part of their world. So yeah, we're just talking about safety and health and, how we keep ourselves and our bodies safe.
Yeah, and you did talk about that with little kids too. There's that healthy behaviors in general. Like these are the things that we do to make our bodies strong. These are the foods that we like to eat so our bodies are healthy, and that, that this is the beginning of a discussion about health in general that paves the way to later discussions about substance abuse.
Yeah, I actually just talked about this with the mom the other day about how, she's really tempted to give her kid cough medicine every single time she coughs or wheezes. And, how that can be really counterproductive in terms of, yeah, sometimes we have the sniffles, but taking medicine isn't always the best or the right action. And so, just medicating every single thing that happens to us maybe isn't the best idea. So anyway, yeah, it's a matter of these things sort of come up organically within the conversations with our kids.
Yeah. Well, okay. Can you talk some about elementary kids? You mentioned inoculation messaging, so that we start that in the elementary years, starting to have those practice conversations.
Well, and they start with things, again, not necessarily about, for a third grader, if someone offers you a beer. It can, but it can also start with things like, how do you respond to someone when they have made you feel uncomfortable? How do you respond when someone is trying to make you do something that you sort of feel like isn't safe for you? And those kind of conversations are important for bullying. They're important for helping kids protect themselves against potential sexual and physical abuse. All of those kinds of conversations are really important. And then depending on what's in your world, if do you have people around you that are vaping, smoking, drinking, I actually think it's really important if you have someone around kids, number one, to protect them, protect kids from people with substance use disorder that may be, challenging. And again, this is coming from experience of having relatives that we've had to protect our children from. But also, there are going to be people around them in their lives who are using drugs and alcohol. And it's really important to talk about, the messaging that comes with that. People ask me a lot, does this mean I can't drink in front of my kids? And I said, I'm never going to say that. I mean, unless you have a alcohol use disorder, in which case then you have some thinking to do. But I am going to say that, it's not that you can't drink in front of your kids. It's that you have to be really careful about the messaging that you're sending about why you're drinking. If you're having constant conversations about, oh, today was such a difficult day at work. I just really need a drink in order to deal with it. Or, we're going to grandma's house for Thanksgiving and there better be a lot of wine there. That's the only way I'm going to emotionally get through this day. That's teaching our kids that we're using drugs and alcohol in order to not feel emotions that upset us. And as we know, and kids have to be able to name their feelings in order to tame their feelings, to quote my friend Tina Payne Bryson. And when we're dampening down our own emotions or looking for ways to not deal with our emotions or numbing out, and we're conveying that purpose of drugs and alcohol to our children, then that's a problem.
There was a really good podcast episode just about 2 weeks ago with Lynn Lyons. Do you listen to her podcast at all? Do you know
No,
Lynn?
I don't.
So she has a great podcast called Flusterclux. She's an anxiety expert, and she did an episode.
Such a great
isn't that a
title.
good name? Lynn is hilarious. She's been on my podcast twice. I just love her. But she has her sister's her co-host, and they did an episode about mommy wine culture. And her sister doesn't drink, but it was the children of alcoholics. And she said after a hard day, the first thing she still thinks is, "Oh, I need a drink." And she doesn't even drink because that was what was modeled to her, right? When she was growing up.
Bewitched. I mean, for me, Bewitched, like Darren, either Darren would come through the door and the very first thing she would do is bring him his martini because he had a hard day at the office. That's, to me, that's like the quintessential vision of, cocktail hour after work.
Yeah, and it's marketed to us all the time too, right? Like, you deserve this. And anyhow, that could be a whole other podcast episode, and Lynn did it. So I'll link to that in the show notes.
I'm so good at throwing in these really contemporary pop culture references like Bewitched.
So I'm your age. I got it. I was talking to someone the other day whose child was named the mum, which is, I forget her name now. What was Samantha's mother's name?
It was like Eldora or something like
yeah,
that.
something. And
like that.
Andorra.
Andorra,
yeah. And she was, I think, too young to know that, the mom that I was talking to. But all I could think of is the Bewitched Witch. Okay.
Not the first person I would name a child after, but okay. Whatever floats your boat.
She was very glamorous. Okay, so let's talk just sort of briefly. We've covered some of these things already, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the risk factors for teens, maybe starting with what in your research you found makes teens more likely to engage in drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, so there are a couple of really predictable factors that raise a teenager's risk of using drugs and alcohol. But the problem is that a lot of those factors are they tend to be conveyed in a really black and white nature. And you talked about this, you mentioned the peers chapter in the addiction inoculation, and that was one of them, which is we know that when a kid's peers use drugs and alcohol, that your kid is more likely to use drugs and alcohol. Absolutely true. However, as that chapter shows, my older son had a friend who had substance use disorder and went to rehab a couple times and got kicked out of a couple high schools. And he wanted to remain loyal to that friend. And it completely freaked me out. But it led to amazing conversations. I was able to say things like, look, I'm just so thrilled you want to support your friend, but this is going to mean we're going to have a lot of conversations about this because here's what the data show. So that's just giving kids more information about what drugs and alcohol do to their body and what can happen. And, Scared Straight is never going to work for kids, the sort of Scared Straight programs and the Just Say No programs. But what works is, and over again, we've learned this, is information. Give kids really good information about what's happening in their brains, why drugs and alcohol are far more dangerous to an adolescent than to an adult, a full-grown adult with a fully developed brain, how actually alcohol and drugs can do permanent damage to their brain and that they react differently within an adolescent's brain and body than they do in an adult's. And I think giving them really good information, and then back to the authoritative parenting stuff about set high expectations, is set some expectations that you and give them the ammunition to make good decisions. So I'm not a Pollyanna who's going to say, give your kids all the information, then step back because they're always going to make good decisions. But let's start by operating from a place of here's all of this really good information, and I trust you to make some good decisions around that. And, those expectations and that trust, can waver, can change over time, but that's at least where we need to start.
A lot of the tips that you talked about for elementary school kids that you just mentioned are really helping them develop the critical thinking skills that they need then when they're older, when they are offered drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, I am. After I did The Gift of Failure, I was asked to be a consultant on this show on Amazon Prime called The Sticky and Dirty Show. And it's just a show that's absolutely delightful to me because it's all about giving sort of their machines, a digger and a dump truck, a problem to deal with, and then making sure they have the support while they make lots of mistakes and figure out how to make better decisions. But the central premise of this show is the question, what if? And if we could just go through, as parents, if we could spend a lot of time asking what if questions, not only can we, foster a lot of really constructive dialogue, but we can also, help our kids practice negotiating really increasingly challenging situations in their world by asking those what if questions. What would happen if you were faced with this? What would happen if your friend did this? That kind of thing.
Well, and one thing I wanted to mention that when we were talking about the, being prepared with the things you can say to say no, is that the way that kids' brains are, they are still moving from concrete to abstract thinking. And so to keep it out of the abstract, we actually have to practice that. We have to role play and practice those turning down excuses.
Well, and what drives me bananas is when people say kids just aren't able to understand consequences. That is so not true. It's just that, especially for adolescents, they weigh the possible good consequences, like the possible benefits of a particular decision, more heavily than they weigh the possible negative outcomes. And so helping them really see what those possible negative outcomes are at least increases the possibility that they will weigh those a little more reasonably against, whatever possible, social, peer pressure, how they feel about themselves, whatever positive benefits they're hoping to get.
Yeah, like what if your coach finds out that you were drinking and you signed that contract and you get kicked off the team? you know?
Well, and also there usually isn't just one way to handle something, and having these conversations a lot about what are the possible ways to handle that, which is why, another thing I talk a lot about in Gift of Failure is modeling all of this for your kids. I mean, we always forget to mention modeling these behaviors because we forget how incredibly powerful that is because it's just in front of our faces all the time. But modeling, making these decisions, talking at the dinner table or wherever your conversation is about a hard decision you had to make at work when you felt really pressured maybe to make a bad ethical decision or whatever, that's really valuable stuff for your kid. It's just another opportunity to discuss this stuff. And if you are worried that your kid, you don't want your kid to know you're not perfect, you've already blown that. So just throw that out the window now.
Hey, one thing that I thought was interesting in your book about how you should handle it if your kids ask you if you've done drugs and alcohol.
This was actually, I have to say, one of the hardest questions to get people to answer in a straightforward way as I was going through. I brought it up with every single expert, and that was where the most hedging happened because it's just, inevitably it ends up sounding like a do as I say, not as I do kind of question. But I think there's some real balance to be struck here. One expert in the book who went unnamed, did not want to be named, said that, when his kids came to him and said, Dad, you really kind of screwed up when you told us about all of your exploits in college because you made it sound so romantic and it made it sound like it was a lot of fun and something that I wanted to do. So don't do that. But also, I think stonewalling and lying to your kids and saying, no, I'm pure as the driven snow. I've had, you see me have beers every once in a while, but I've never done anything else. When that's not true, if that's not true, is also not your best bet. So for us as a family where we talk a lot about why I don't drink now. And, for me anyway, alcohol has always been my main issue. And I never really was into any other drugs. But my husband has some experience really sort of cooking his brain on weed for a good year after college. And that year we still refer to as my husband's lost year. And it was a really directionless time for him. And we do a lot of talking about the fact that year was not fun for him and that smoking all that weed may have made him feel better in the moment. But what it did overall was put off his ability to motivate and do something different with his life. And when he actually did figure out what he wanted to do differently, he needed his brain to work well because he had to memorize a lot of stuff. He ended up going back to school and he had done some long-term damage to his hippocampus, which is where, we know for a fact that chronic users of marijuana that are adolescents have smaller hippocampuses than kids who don't. So, and that's where memory is formed. So, these are, yes, your dad did these drugs and here is, the positive and negative outcomes of that year.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's you almost did the same thing of your experts. Just not like a totally straight answer.
Yeah, no, there's a middle ground. Honesty, you don't need to glorify. You don't need to, definitely don't glorify. You don't need to, kids don't need to know all of the hideous details of like the day you were passed out on the floor of the, restaurant bathroom, but they do. I think when you're coming from a place of some honesty that kids know that. And so I think it's the best possible scenario is to ride that line in the middle of not glorifying, not romanticizing, not giving the ugly, disgusting details of it, but to talk about very specifically, what drugs you've used and what the positive and negative benefits may have been.
Yeah. And wait till you're 21.
Yeah.
I heard you say this on my friend Casey's podcast that a good party line for teenagers is don't do it until you're 21. And if you do it, I want you to talk to me about it and tell me about it.
Yeah. And then don't do it until you're 21. I even shy away from that because for me, I think, legality matters. Yes, there is legality matters, but my message is always coming from a place of brain development and being their mom and wanting to protect their brains. And so worrying, if we talk too much about legality, it's sort of that blind following because that's the rule thing that I always try to shy away from my kids. So giving them the information, around why that age of legality is the age of legality and what, ideally I would love it if they'd wait till they were 24, 25, but here we are.
Well, in Canada, it's actually 19, but I was just sort of using that as an example of.
Well, get this. I just presented at a school in Japan, and I did not know this until I started researching Japan. But the age of legality there is 20. But vending machines are ubiquitous. Beer vending machines are ubiquitous. And all you have to do is, hit a little button that says, are you over the age of 20? And of course, no
Well, I
one's.
remember, I'm gonna like make myself look bad here, but I remember buying cigarettes from a vending machine when I was 10 years
Yeah.
old
Oh,
with my friends.
absolutely. With the pull knobs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
I love that people have been, I've seen versions of those that have been updated and have all kinds of fun things in them. Like, I don't know, people have taken those old machines but it's just mystifying to me that anyone could just pull a knob and, you
yeah,
have a
and they
buck
were
50,
like a
you can pull a
dollar.
knob.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's just wrap up here with one thing that I thought was really interesting that I think also parents of teenagers can use to support them in helping their kids not go down the road of drugs and alcohol, which is the dopamine and excitement and risk question that you talk about. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
So, first of all, that risk word, what I like to say is that risk word bugs me only because normally what people say is adolescents are wired for risk. And that's not entirely true. Adolescents are wired for novelty for a very good reason, because as we know, as Lauren Steinberg writes about in Age of Opportunity, as just about anyone who writes about the teenage brain will say, is that, the purpose of adolescence is to get kids competent, get them to go outside their comfort zone, get them to become competent in new things so that they can become adults and go out in the world and have mastery and skills and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's important to remember that. I think it's also important to remember that at baseline, adolescents have lower baseline levels of dopamine than little kids or adults. And dopamine is not just about excitement and joy and happiness. Yes, it is the reward system in the brain, but it's really about drive. Dopamine is what gives us drive to get up out of bed in the morning and know that you have a purpose for the day and to get some stuff done and to work towards something. And when your baseline levels of dopamine are low, you feel bored. And, that boredom can be really difficult to bear. And so what we know is that great ways to get boosts of dopamine are by trying new things, by achieving mastery over something, by achieving a feeling of self-efficacy, by feeling like you really did it. You really worked it and achieved something. And that's where those natural boosts of dopamine come from. And, to be frank, they can't compare. The high we can create naturally within our body can't really compare to the artificial, massive high of a bolus of an opiate or whatever. But it's how we create a feeling in our kids of that drive and wanting to move forward and having intrinsic motivation and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's really important to remember that one of the most protective things we can do is help push our kids towards positive risks so that they can start developing their own internal sense of, I can boost my own levels of dopamine all on my own. Because it's that question of why kids first use drugs or alcohol, that first day, that first use, as Chris Herron says, that we have to get our brains around. And that the reason they often feel like they need to use is just because they're craving novelty. They're craving a feeling of escape. They're feeling a need to numb trauma. You talked about Dr. Gabor Mate, and everyone should read his book, In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts. The more we can help promote kids' feelings of being worthy, feeling like they're worthy to take up space, that they have self-efficacy, that they have hope, that they have mastery, that they have competence. Those are some of the most protective things we can give kids.
That's beautiful. And when you talk about the boredom, I was reminded of something I read about Iceland and that they had like a massive teenage drinking problem in Iceland. And how they combated it was building community centers, places for teenagers to go and play ping pong and hang out and do like rock climbing. And so they, instead of saying don't drink, they provided them with other things to do. And I know in my very small town when I was a teenager, there wasn't anything to do on weekend nights except for go to keggers in the woods, basically.
Right. Yeah. And there's actually a beautiful article actually by Emma Young in The Atlantic. It was 2017. And the title is How Iceland Got Teens to Say No to Drugs. And it's a beautifully articulated explanation of what you were just describing. They did a beautiful job. And yeah. And, as always, it's sort of like when I'm talking about education policy and someone says, well, if we could just be more like Finland, you got to draw some big caveats to that, which is, Iceland is smaller. Iceland tends to be more homogenous, all those sorts of things. But there are some caveats, but it is a fantastic outcomes that they have achieved.
Well, I mean, still, but the point is, like, when teens have other things to do and they're not bored, they're probably less likely to turn to drugs and alcohol as an entertainment.
And there's a fantastic resource here called Spectrum Youth and Family Services, and that's the idea behind that as well, is giving kids the support, giving kids things to be focused on, giving kids sort of hope. I mean, that's the other big one, and giving kids a sense of self-efficacy. That's what they do there, and it's the reason they're still around is it seems to be working.
I wonder what the research is going to show coming out of the pandemic, how that's affected teenagers and substance use. Because I know with my teenagers, there were no parties for 2 years, right? There wasn't anything like that in terms of like that risk factor was a lot lower because there weren't the gatherings where people might be doing drugs and alcohol. But then there's also the isolation and lack of these activities. Has the research started to come out around that?
So heading into the pandemic, some of the best research we have, for example, like monitoring the future that comes out of University of Michigan annually, that survey, it's a risk and behavior survey, and it's fantastic. The problem is that many of the routes by which we collect that data were interrupted. So whether that's school, whether that's physicians, whether that's when you're canceling a lot of those sort of unnecessary things like your well child checkups or whatever, you interrupt the flow of that data. So I think it's going to take a couple of years for us to really shake out. Every once in a while now we're getting a new study saying, oh, everyone assumed that, for example, suicidal ideation went way, way, way up, and here's what the real numbers look like. And then we'll get another study that said, oh, but here the suicidal, referrals for suicidal ideation went way up, not down. I think it's going to take some time for us to really shake out what the aftermath looks like and what actually happened during. And some of that's going to require kids to actually do some first person recounting of their experience, and that's fine. But the data is going to be interesting, and I think it's going to be a lag time of probably about 3 years, but that's my guess.
We'll keep our eyes open. Is there anything that you wanted to share that I haven't asked you about that you feel is important?
I think the biggest thing for me is I wrote the addiction inoculation, in between. I have a kid now who's 23 and I have a kid now who's 18. When I started this, they were obviously younger. When I got sober, they were like 9 and 14. I have learned so much from this book. I wasn't even going to put a college chapter in the book, for example, because I was like, well, why? Everyone drinks in college. Turns out not at all true. I didn't know that. I had to learn a lot in order to sort of get past the myths and get to the real meat of it. But I'm in a position now where I raised my older child one way because I used the best possible information I had on hand, the beliefs I had as a parent, including the way I was raised, all that kind of stuff. And then I have this younger kid who I'm finishing up raising him, knowing what I know now and having shared with him everything I know now. So one kid, the older kid, got to have sips, got to have his own glass of beer at dinner, that kind of thing. And my younger kid, for whom this is all terribly unfair, now our party line with him is no, sorry, not until you're older. And it's not just that we pulled the rug out from under him and said, this is the new rule, don't ask any questions. It's that he knows what we know. We've given him the information to explain all of this. And that if I were to do anything different, what he would hear is, mom has the best possible information around drug and alcohol prevention. She knows what it's like to be addicted because she's a recovering alcoholic. And yet she's allowing me to have sips, which is counter to what the research shows. So all I'm doing is modeling what I want to see in my kids, which is to operate from the best possible information we have. And if we learn how to do better, we say, you know what, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And now I'm going to move forward with the best information I have. So for me, the fact that I'm raising my two children differently is as much, that's me making my own life, my own parenting, the example of the best I think we can do for kids.
Which beautifully leads me to our last question, which I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time and give advice to your younger parent self, what would it be? It could be completely unrelated to what we've been talking about or related. It's up to you.
For me, I think the mantra that I still have, and this comes back from, when I was sort of developing gift of failure, which is, parenting thing is a long haul job. It is not our worthiness as parents, our success as parents is not determined in the everyday emergencies. It's determined over the long haul. And so I'm constantly having to come back to, okay, but where do I want my kid to be in a month, in 6 months, in a year? And that's the same thing in my teaching too. Do I want my students to know every tiny minutia of this work of literature, or do I want them to have the big picture of the place of this work of literature in the larger construct of humanity? And for me, that's what it comes down to. Do I want this done perfectly now with me butting in and telling my kid how to do it and nagging, or do I want my kid to be able to do it himself next time? So that long-term look at progress over process, looking at the process and the progress over end product, that's, for me, long-term haul, that's what I have to remember every day.
So sort of back off and be patient.
Just have some patience over, not every emergency needs to be intervened in and handled and, molded to perfection. There are a lot of moments when it might just be best for us to step back and allow our kids to go to school with dirty clothes on because they're refusing to do their laundry or whatever that thing is. Yeah, long haul job. Give ourselves a little bit of a break. Give our kids a little bit of a break and remember the long-term goals.
Love that. Can you tell our listeners where they can find out more about you?
Sure. So I'm at jessicalahey.com, Lahey, and I'm at Twitter at Jess Lahey and at Instagram at Teacher Lahey.
Great. And we'll link to both your books in the show notes.
Fantastic. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated our conversation today.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.